Hey everybody, it's Dr. Segrin here, bringing you another YouTube lecture. You might notice that my setting is different. I'm not using some fancy green screen background. I am back in the classroom recording this video. It's going to be nice in some respects that I won't have dogs barking in the background. In other respects, I'm in a more social environment now with COVID. We'll see how that goes. So what we're going to talk about in this video is some chemistry. And I will admit, chemistry, when I was growing up in school and when I was in college, was probably my least favorite of the science subjects. If you compare it to biology or environmental science or physics or geology or any of those things that I kind of consider fun and neat, I think chemistry was always kind of there was always the promise of doing labs and like chemistry experiments, and you always thought you were going to get to blow up something, and you never were allowed to, and it was always just kind of lame. So with that in mind, we are going to cover some chemistry, and I'll try to keep it interesting. And basically, we're just going to do a review of all things chemistry, really the basics of chemistry, and things that are relevant to Earth as we move forward and begin talking about Earth's chemistry. So let's jump right in. So basically, we're going to be covering relevant chemistry to understanding Earth. So these, I think, are the basics of chemistry that we need to understand moving forward if we're going to understand various environmental issues and how Earth actually works. So let's start off with the basics. What is chemistry? We say chemistry is the study of matter. Okay, well, what is matter? I had an 8th grade science teacher who was awesome, and he basically said matter is stuff. Okay, so pretty much anything that has some kind of like physical aspect to it, we could call matter. So anything that is a solid or a gas or a liquid, all those things are made of stuff, and that stuff is matter. There you go. If we went out deep into outer space, and there was no gas and no liquids and no solids, that would be no matter. There would be no matter out there. And that's true. Out deep into outer space, away from Earth, there's virtually no matter out there. There might be some tiny little dust particles, but pretty much nothing out there. Something else that we say about matter is that matter is made up of protons and neutrons and electrons. And I'm sure everybody's seen this diagram and remembers seeing this diagram at some point during school, where you have this diagram of an atom where in the nucleus you have protons and neutrons, and around the outside you have electrons. All right, earlier in one of these YouTube lectures, the one on space science, I showed you a video called The Cosmic Eye. It was kind of like this cosmic zoom out. So you start on Earth and you zoom out all the way out to galaxies and the universe at large. And that video actually had a second part to it that I didn't show you yet because I was waiting for this moment, where you zoom back in and you zoom to smaller and smaller and smaller things on Earth. So let's watch that. All right, so that should have given you an idea of kind of the different scales of matter in the universe. So when we're talking about stuff in the universe, we can be talking about things as big as stars and galaxies, or we can be zoomed all the way in onto atoms and protons and neutrons, and even inside protons and neutrons. That's quarks. It's a little advanced. We don't need to go there. But you have all this different sizes when it comes to matter. So let's go review these different scales and sizes of different things. So when we're talking about things that are small, we would say kind of the three main things that we will be referencing in this course, which are things like atoms and molecules and cells. Atoms would be the smallest. So many atoms are going to make up a molecule. And that's what we see over here on the right, this DNA molecule. Let's start off though, just talking about water. We say water has 3 atoms. You probably know the abbreviations for those, H2O, which means that there's 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. And so that's what makes a water molecule up. And some molecules can be massive. So, for example, one molecule of DNA can have 10 billion atoms in it. That's that number right there. And here we can see that this is our DNA molecule over here, the big thing, this big spirally thing. The whole thing is DNA. So this whole stretch is all DNA, and it goes on really long time. But each one of these little tiny balls represents different atoms. So you can see that some molecules can be quite big and are made up of many atoms. If we're talking about the human body, we say molecules would be making up your cells. So each one of your cells in your body, and again, this is what, if we zoomed in with a microscope on this is actually lung tissue. If we zoomed in and took a sample of your lungs and zoomed in on it, we would see it's made of these different tiny lung cells. Well, each one of those cells is estimated to have about 2 trillion molecules in it. So that is a lot of molecules per each one of your cells. And then if we look at your entire body, we see that your entire body is actually made up of about 40 trillion cells. So we kind of begin seeing this picture emerge that's kind of similar to space science and the universe. As we zoom out in the universe, we just realize how much of everything there is, how many different stars and planets and galaxies there are, and it's quite incredible. When we look at really tiny things, we kind of see the same thing. Your body has just trillions of cells. Each cell has trillions of molecules, and each molecule is made up of several atoms. So, the numbers of atoms that are in your body are comparable to the numbers of stars in the universe. So, in a sense, you kind of contain an entire universe of stuff in you. All right, now you might be asking yourself, and I even made reference to it, we were talking about water being made of H2O, hydrogen and oxygen, and we've even referenced this periodic table already in this class where you have all these different types of elements. Where do elements come into the picture? What is an element? How does it relate to what we already know about matter, atoms and molecules and such? Elements are different kinds of atoms. So we know atoms are those tiny little building blocks that make up molecules and cells. Well, there are many different types of atoms, and those different types of atoms are called elements. For example, sulfur you might have heard of, carbon, iron. These are all different elements in the world, and the reason we have different elements is that basically different types of atoms have different numbers of protons, and through kind of complicated processes of physics, having different numbers of protons usually leads to different numbers of neutrons and electrons, and then that leads to different chemical characteristics. And so basically, each unique proton combination of an atom gives a kind of unique chemical characteristic, and that's what we call an element. And so elements all have unique characteristics. For example, iron is going to behave very differently chemically than something like sulfur or carbon. And that depends on its atomic structure, how many protons, electrons, and neutrons it has. All of these elements and atoms are abbreviated in chemistry because it takes too long to list out the full name of things. We, for example, use abbreviations like H for hydrogen or O for oxygen. And this is information that you can find on a periodic table of elements, basically what all the abbreviations are. It's nothing more complicated than that. If you see an abbreviation that's not familiar with, that you're not familiar with, you can always check a periodic table to figure out what it means. I think we're all familiar with H2O. That doesn't sound strange to us, but maybe C8H18 does sound strange, and that's fine. But all C8H18 is saying is that there are 8 carbon atoms and 18 hydrogen atoms in this one molecule, and that happens to be gasoline. Something else that's essential to understand about chemistry is the idea of a chemical reaction. So elements and molecules can rearrange themselves during chemical reactions. So here is an example, and usually chemical reactions are going to be, you can tell a chemical reaction is going on when you see this arrow. If you see an arrow pointing to different substances, different combinations of atoms and these abbreviations, then that's an indicator that a chemical reaction is happening. For example, this is a pretty common chemical reaction in the world when you are driving your car and burning gasoline. This is the molecule you're typically burning, which is called octane, which is part of gasoline. If you ever see the little number as you're pumping gas, like 89 or 91, that is the percentage of the gasoline that is octane. And so generally speaking, the more octane there is, the higher quality gas it is. But you have gas in your car, and your car needs to take in oxygen. That's called your air intake, and so that's shown here. So basically, if you combine gasoline with oxygen, and usually you need some kind of spark as well, the atoms will rearrange themselves to make water, H2O, and CO2, which is known as carbon dioxide. And I think some of these big fancy names and all the letters is why some people maybe get lost and feel a little bit overwhelmed by chemistry. And I think some of the names also contribute to that. So, for example, saying carbon dioxide, it's like, what the heck is that? Well, all we're saying is it's got carbon in it, which is the C. Carbon, di refers to 2, and oxide refers to oxygen. So it's really just saying carbon, 2 oxygens, carbon dioxide. So I think a lot of people see all that and kind of vaguely understand it or kind of follow along, but it doesn't quite completely click. And that is one of the nice things about being in the classroom, is that I can kind of do more demonstrations because I have more laboratory supplies here. So let's see if we can understand this concept of a chemical reaction a little better.
All right, so I'm going to show you a chemical reaction here, and that stuff I said about in chemistry where you never get to blow anything up or light anything on fire. Well, when you get to be a teacher, then you get to light things on fire again at your own risk. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to burn something, and we're going to talk about it as we watch it burn. I don't have gasoline in the classroom, but I do have a flammable liquid here. This is rubbing alcohol. And we'll talk about what happens when rubbing alcohol lights on fire. But first, safety.
Wait, you gotta make sure that your lab is safe before you make up measurements about the space. Got your gloves pulled up, got your goggles on, don't want to be.
All right, so we are going to light some alcohol on fire here and talk about it as it burns. If you didn't know, alcohol is flammable. So let's see what happens. So what we're going to see is, as I'm going to put some alcohol on the table here, is that it will light on fire, and that is a chemical reaction. As it is, it's not changing anything because for this particular chemical reaction, we need to add a bit of energy to get it going, which will be provided by here. Whoa. You can see it's burning quite hot. And you can ask yourself the question, can this burn forever? Why or why not? Eventually, as we can begin seeing, it's going to run out of fuel. That is because fundamentally the alcohol on the table is undergoing a change. And when the alcohol is all gone, when every molecule of alcohol is changed, the chemical reaction has to stop. Now you can also ask yourself the question, where did that alcohol go? Did it disappear? Is it gone from the world forever? There is something called the conservation of matter, which states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. And so that means that the alcohol, the atoms and molecules that made up that alcohol, are still present in the world. Where did they go? Well, they're all around us right now. When you burn alcohol, it produces carbon dioxide and water, and the water is really, really hot, so it turns into steam. And so that water and alcohol are now in the air around me, and I'm actually probably breathing in the atoms that used to be part of that alcohol. That is what we mean by a chemical reaction. The chemicals fundamentally change and turn into something new. They don't disappear, they just turn into something new.
All right, so speaking of chemical reactions, in earth science, there are some pretty important chemicals in chemical reactions called acids and bases. And essentially, these are just certain molecules that scientists have figured out are extremely reactive with one another. And they are also very important in Earth, and we will be discussing that in the next video lecture. But as some background on acids and bases, most, but not all, acids we say have something called a positively charged hydrogen ion. That's denoted by this H with a plus. And all it means to be positively charged is that this atom has more protons than electrons. And there's a word for that. When you have different numbers of protons and electrons in an atom, we call that an ion. And so this would represent a hydrogen ion, or a positive hydrogen ion. And bases are, generally speaking, what's called a hydroxide ion, or an O, an oxygen, and a hydrogen, which is negatively charged, meaning it has more electrons than protons. This isn't a chemistry class, so we won't go into more detail than that, but the idea is that if you combine these two and put them together, you end up with a H and an OH. One is positively charged and one is negatively charged, so that means that they are attracted to each other, and these things will combine, and you have one H, one O, and another H. That's H2O. These acid-base reactions, when you mix an acid and a base, these molecules, they almost always produce a water molecule as a result. Now, usually these hydrogens and hydroxide ions are attached to something else, and so you'll get some other chemistry, some other chemicals that are produced. But typically, you will make water with an acid-base reaction. Something else that we will reference throughout the year is something called the pH scale. And basically, this is just a measurement of how strong acids and bases are. And you might have heard of this or seen this in chemistry before, but basically the scale goes from 0 to 14. And below 7 is considered an acid, and above 7 is considered a base. So if 7 in the middle is neutral, that is basically water, and you can see that right there. Everything that's below 7 is considered an acid, and everything that's above 7 is considered a base. Another word for base sometimes is alkali is used. We will go over some examples of different acids and bases later on in our next virtual lab. Something though to consider about the pH scale is that it is logarithmic, meaning that a change in 1 actually represents a times 10 in concentration. So for example, going from say a 6 on the pH scale to a 3, might not sound like a lot, but actually each jump in number is actually a times 10. So from going from 6 to 5 is 1 times 10. So you're going 10 times, so a 5 is 10 times stronger than a 6. Going from 5 to 4 is another times 10. And then going from 4 to 3 is another times 10. And you might be going, oh, okay, 3 times 10, that's like 30 times more concentrated. Nope, no, what this corresponds to is 10 times 10, oops, times 10. 10 times 10 is 100, times 10 is 1,000. So going from a 6 to a 3 doesn't sound like much, but that's actually 1,000 times more concentrated of an acid or stronger of an acid. And what that means is it has 1,000 times more hydrogen ions than a 6 would be. So a 3 would have 1,000 times more hydrogen ions than a 6. And something else that you're going to need to know for your next lab is something about a chemical indicator. Usually we measure pH, and you kind of see the colors on this scale with something called a chemical indicator. And we will use chemical indicators numerous times in this course as well. Basically, a chemical indicator is it's a test or a device that basically produces a color change in response to a chemical. So for example, in the presence of really, really high hydrogen ions, this particular chemical indicator that we'll be using for our first lab will indicate a red color. And if it had a super high number of hydroxide ions indicating a strong base, it will get to a blue color. And so you can tell what chemicals are acids and which chemicals are bases based on this color change. And that's called a chemical indicator. All right, so that's it. See, that wasn't so bad. Chemistry, it doesn't have to be the worst. And if we can get a good kind of basic and fundamental understanding of some basic chemistry concepts, it's going to go a long way to understanding the rest of the material this year. So I hope you learned something, and let me know if you have any questions, and see you later.